And welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Talking with Tarashuk Podcast. My name is Will Tarashuk. It's T as in Thomas, A-R-A-S-H-U-K. And I am talking about police yet again, not about retirement, about actual people on the force, now retired. My guest is Desmond Ryan. Desmond is a retired police detective from Toronto, Canada. So we're going to talk about police over the border as well as here in the States. But he is now a writer, He is a writer. He writes a police procedural series and a light mystery series. He has been a frontline officer, a beat cop, a patrol sergeant, and instructor at the Toronto Police College and detective over a 30-year career. We have a lot to discuss, his books, all that in the works. Desmond, pleasure to meet you, sir. Thanks for being on the podcast from Canada.
Hey, thanks, Will. Thank you for inviting me. This is wonderful. Thank you.
Well, you reached out to me, my friend. You emailed me. So at the end of my podcast, when I say email me at willapspodcast.com, you make me go, ooh, that's interesting. You are living proof, yet again, that I'm a man of my word. So thank you for being here. I do appreciate it.
It's going to be great. It's going to be great. Let's go.
So you got the microphone. Are you a podcast? Are you work in content creation?
No, well? actually, I don't, but I do a lot of podcasts. And so I've been told that if I want to sound good, I need to have a microphone.
You do.
So I dropped a few bucks, very inexpensive, picked myself up a microphone, and here I am.
Well, it's much better than just using your laptop, trust me. So I appreciate that as well. So just please introduce yourself. Let's start off there. Who you are and why you want to come on the podcast.
Well, my name is, as you said, is Desmond Ryan. I'm a retired Toronto police detective from here in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And I've been listening to your podcast, thought it was really interesting, thought I might have something to contribute. So as you said, reached out, you reached back, and here we are.
It took a little bit. I'm starting to realize I should probably slow down my bookings. You know, you reach out to me probably end of January, early February, and I was like, I'll get back to you. I promise you, I'll get back to you. I bookmarked the email, and then as soon as I had an open week, I was like, let's get on this. So I appreciate the patience, and thanks for reminding me I should probably slow down a little bit. But okay, let's talk about you being a cop. So what's policing like in Canada, and how is it different from how it is here in the States, and how did you end up becoming a police officer? Let's start there. How you became a cop and how it's different.
Well, I became a police officer in the late 80s. That's how old I am. I was 10 at the time. But at that time, there were not, I took a degree in English literature and political science at university, and there wasn't a great call for people with undergrad degrees, for jobs in that particular discipline. And just kind of thought policing might be fun. And I had some neighbors who were police officers who thought it was a great job. So thought, I'll give it a go, give it, 5 years, see what happens. And next thing I know is 30 years later and it's over. So it was a good run.
It's kind of funny how that works, right? You're just like, I'm going to do this for a little bit. You hear it all the time, like people who move somewhere. We're going to move to Nashville just for a few years. And next thing you know, 40 years later, 3 kids out of college, and that's just how it works.
Yeah, exactly. And when I started, even now, our gun laws are very different in Canada than in the States. And I think that's a big difference in our crimes. And who's committing them, how they're being committed. And I remember when I started in the 80s, most of the fights were sort of hand to hand. It was mostly fist fights. And then in the early 90s, we went to knives. And I remember distinctly in Toronto, it was like a switch where people were carrying knives all the time. And now we have people carrying guns, but it's not like it is where you are. And again, because our laws are really different around that.
Right. So now you as an officer, what are you equipped with to protect yourself? Like I'm assuming, like here in the States, right? They have a baton, they got handcuffs, they might have some kind of spray, and also, of course, they have their firearm. Now, when you're in Canada, do you also have a firearm?
Yes. Yeah. When I started, what we had was a Smith & Wesson 6-shooter, which is really inaccurate unless you shoot a lot. And we had handcuffs. And we had, at that time, they gave us what was called a stick that nobody could actually work very, very well. They switched that over to an expandable baton, which I think most of your people now have. And they switched us over to the Glocks, which are a lot easier to operate, a lot easier to load, all that sort of stuff. And the officers now have the pepper spray, handcuffs, They have the Glocks, they have the expandable batons, and they have tasers.
Yeah, I forgot about the taser. Of course, the taser. So I'm glad you said that, like, the pistol itself is inaccurate, because I say that to anybody who's like never shot a gun, because a common argument here in America is, why can't a cop just aim for the leg, right? Why do they have to shoot them in the chest? Well, the answer is because pistols, particularly, are very inaccurate weapons. If you've ever shot a pistol, it's super inaccurate. I've only shot one a few times, and I'm a very bad shot. So, and they teach you to shoot for the chest, because that's what the center of gravity is. It's most likely to hit someone. If you're in a highly populated area, you're aiming for the leg, hits the asphalt, bounce up, hits someone else.
Well, mostly what
that's
they
worst
talk
case
about,
scenario.
Most of it is, it's to stop the threat. That's the language that's used. And so obviously the largest sort of body of mass is the best spot, and you're most likely to hit it, right? Because as you say, I mean, again, it's not like a target practice where you're doing your breathing and you're zenned out and you're totally focused. It's usually a split-second decision where the officer pulls out their gun. They're in a shoot or don't shoot situation, and so the chances of hitting anything realistically are pretty slim. And so that's why they say center of mass, and that's what you aim for.
Now, do you? I'm trying to think. If U.S. cops even have like assault rifles. I know we have the riot gear. We have the rifles with the rubber bullets. Now, do you only have handguns, or is there other types of, I guess, weaponry, for lack of a better term? And like cops here have like the big SUVs that are like bulletproof and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, our in Toronto we call the emergency task force. It's the same as your SWAT people, right? They have the big trucks, and they've got everything, all the toys in there. And there's shotguns that the officers have that I believe they can take them out patrolling, but they're in the back. Now the cars have them so that the locks are in the car themselves. So you can take the shotgun out. But again, Toronto's a large urban center. We've got like 3 million people here. So you don't really want to be walking around with a shotgun.
Yeah, that would make, even if I was one holding the gun, I'd be very uncomfortable. Like, no, because like I live outside New York City, so I go into New York City for work a few times a week. And in around Times Square, there's the police. There's a police center like right in Times Square, and every day there's guys out there just holding assault rifles, or they're in Port Authority just holding assault rifles, just in case, because it's a major hub. It makes sense. But even if I was that person, I'd be like, I'd feel uncomfortable. I don't get that uncomfortable walking by them, but if I was holding the gun, I'd feel uncomfortable, because you're immediately a target. Even when it's there to protect yourself and others, you are a target.
Well, yeah, and that's, I mean, when I first started in policing, they were just coming out with the bulletproof vests, and it was optional to wear it or not. Now, when I was going through training, they just came out with them, and so we wore them. But when we were sent to the divisions, we were seen as kind of like the weenies who were wearing them. And now everybody wears them, the Kevlar vests, and they're really, really hot, and they're heavy, and they're uncomfortable, and all of that stuff. But the option is not good, because you're a target.
Right, of course. Now, you were in Toronto, like the city proper, or were you a police officer mostly? Okay.
Yeah, I was always in Toronto.
City policing is way different from suburban policing, obviously, because there's more people, more crime, more danger. But do you know, like, suburban police officers? I don't know how rural it is outside of Toronto. Is it more suburban, or is it a little more spread out? Because I'm trying to get to the point of, like, the community, like the relationship of the police officers with the community. It's obviously a lot better with smaller communities because people know each other. But
in Toronto, it's you've got like the sort of city proper that's heavily populated. Then you have the suburbs, which is still a part of Toronto. Okay. And then outside of that, you have smaller cities. You have towns and rural areas. And I'm born and raised in Toronto, so I don't know any different. I know community policing in the divisions I worked in worked really well in the downtown core because it was so congested. And even though you might not be dealing with the type of community with, sort of families that we expect, the community would be more of business people, right? So you have business owners and shopkeepers and things like that. So we still had a really strong sense of community.
What's the training process like? Like how long does it take for you to become a cop? What are the requirements? Either it's either physical, mental, intellectual as well?
Well, the physical is they've changed it a bit since I came on. You still have to be able to run, and I'm not a runner. But as I've always said, when someone is sort of dangling a really cool job and pension for life in front of you, you can run a mile and a half really fast. And so that kind of looked after that. We used to have to do push-ups and sit-ups, and now they do it where the recruits have to be able to drag things, which makes a little more sense. Because in my entire 30 years of policing, I've never, ever been asked as a job requirement to do push-ups. So I don't know what that was all about. But the whole drag test is just basically to see your general, ability to manage your body and pull stuff and things like that. They do a psychological test, and it's basically looking at, mostly your overt biases, a bit of implied biases, just to kind of weed out, any really obvious, psychopathic tendencies, things like that. And the requirement now is that you have to have academically, it is a post, you have to have, I believe, a few credits from a post-secondary school environment. So it used to be just high school, and now you have to have done, a couple of semesters at least at a post-secondary school institution, whether it's a university or a college. Now, Toronto is incredibly multicultural. That we have over 140 different mother tongues spoken in the home. So we really, really like officers with language skills because that's super important.
Like, is French Canadian? Is French big in Canada? Is Toronto, excuse me, as well?
It's not as big in Toronto as you would think. It is our second national language rather, but in Toronto, you've got people who are speaking Korean, people speaking Mandarin, people speaking Greek, Italian, Russian, you name it, they're speaking it. And so it becomes problematic when officers attend calls and they can't communicate with people.
Right.
So that's why we look for people with all sorts of different languages. The Toronto Police Service also really looks for candidates who will reflect the communities. So we want Muslim officers. We want officers who speak Urdu. We want women. We want people of color. We want, people that look like the people who live here.
I understand that. Now, I do want to get back to that, but first, when I think a big problem that officers have in the States is that they don't live in the communities they're policing. Right, so you have someone who could live in a expensive community or in a more expensive township, and then they're policing like a bad part of a major city, and they get this complex, whether it's mental, and they feel it's one way or the other. Does that also exist in Canada when it comes to policing, or is it kind of not mandated, but it could be mandated? Maybe it should be mandated. That if you're going to police a community, you have to actually be a part of the community and live in that community.
Well, it's really interesting you brought that up, Will, because that's been an ongoing conversation for a very long time. Because
it's very complex. Like I don't make it sound like it's a very simple solution. But yeah, please continue.
Exactly, right? Because you're thinking, if you're not part of the community, are you vested in it? Mm-hmm. Right? And that sense of, at the end of the day, you go home and, you leave all the problems of the community there and you go off to your little, sort of picket fence house. And it's really easy to sort of taint your view of the world based on where you police.
Right.
But the reality is in Toronto, it's a very, very expensive city to live in. I believe at this time, less than 30% of all officers in Toronto live in the city itself because it's expensive.
So expensive.
Yeah. And
right. I mean,
and the flip side of that as well is that officers, after they do their 10-hour shift or 12-hour shift, they have to commute to where they live, which could be another hour, hour and a half, 2 hours each way.
And they don't take the patrol car home. They have to take their own car.
That's right.
Right.
Right. So you're putting on, 70, 80, 90 miles on your own car each way. plus gas,
Yep.
plus time, and you've already done your 12-hour shift. And if you get overtime, or if you have court, like if you're working a midnight shift and you have to go to court, then what do? Right. So it's a real challenge to get people, engaged in the city, engaged in the work that needs to be done. In terms of, if there's overtime or court involved, officers are saying, I don't want overtime. I've been here long enough. I just want to go home. The other issue that we have in Toronto is that officers will come here, work here for a while, realize that they're tired of commuting, 2 to 4 hours a day, and switch to a police service closer to where they live. And so we lose the officers.
And on the flip side of the argument, even like if this is more applied in towns, but I know in the town I grew up in, some of the cops who did live in the town, corruption isn't the right word, but they would let things slide. Like if they picked up a group of high schools who were drinking underage, like at the park or whatever, they had to bust something, or drunk driving. Well, insert silly crime here. They would let it slide because they know their parents or this, that, and the other. And that's just a regular standard thing that teenagers go through. But that same principle could be applied to bigger crimes, or it's easier for them to be corrupted in those crimes. If it's like a money laundering thing within the town, it's easy to get someone on the cut when you live in the same town as you. So that is the counter argument to the community. And I think it's a valid one.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's more the sort of the letting stuff slide because these are your neighbors.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
So, you don't
it's hard to arrest your neighbors.
Exactly. And you don't want to be standing in the grocery line, with the person that you just had a punch out with the other night and threw them in jail. And, right. So that's the flip side of that. Absolutely.
I think at the end of the day, when it comes to most policing or any job, really, it needs to come down on an individual person by person basis, right? Is this person qualified enough to work in this police force, in this precinct? If the answer is yes, great. But you got to monitor that too, especially mentally. It's like if you're gonna be a cop and you're in a bad neighborhood, every now and then you got to check up on that cop to make sure he doesn't form a bias and that can affect his policing. And if you find that bias and you find that effect, you got to move him somewhere else.
Well, that's absolutely correct. And I mean, I'm 100% behind that, because what happens is it's like that slippery slope. You don't realize how biased you're getting, how jaded you're getting, how tainted, because everybody around you is. Right? And we talk about each division having its own personality because it has its own sets of communities. And it's really easy, I think, to say, well, because you work in this division, you're going to be like that, as opposed to saying, no, we need to have a standard that everybody sort of upholds, which we do in terms of enforcing criminal stuff, but also in terms of the welfare of the officers. And I remember once I worked in a really rough division that had a lot of street level crime, street level drug dealing, sex trade work. And I knew I was in a bit of trouble when I was at a cocktail party in my personal life. And I was telling somebody about the street level cost of various sex acts. I thought, oh, I've been here too long. This is normal. People don't talk about this kind of stuff. I need to get out.
Right. I mean, as a cop, there's plenty of levels of danger, but I am going to circle it back to diversity, because diversity, people love talking about diversity. Everyone loves talking about diversity, but diversity itself can also be a double-edged sword. Now, I do agree with you. It is smart to have people from your community represented in the police force. Like you said, people who don't speak Korean, that's going to be a dangerous thing. Or Muslim. If it's a cultural dispute, you want to have someone who understands the culture in there. But that can also be a double-edged sword, because if they're not qualified, if you're just hiring someone for a quota, just to get that diversity or whatever it could be, even if it's extra funding from the state, because they had those fundings, you need to make sure that you reach the guidelines and make sure they reach the bar to be an effective police officer. Because at the end of the day, your goal as a cop in the municipality isn't to represent the community, it's to protect the community. Remember, when I say represent, I don't mean demographically by statistics. Like, U.S. has 13% black population. The police force needs to be 13%. I think that's a nightmare. The police officer, if it's 5%, great. If it's 15%, even better. If it's 20%, let the chips fall where they may, because at the end of the day, that's how you're going to get the best policing when it comes to training and this, that, and the other.
Well, one of the things that I know, because I'm sitting on a committee that's looking at some of the hiring practices, is really what it's looking at is why aren't the police services getting the types of candidates they want? Why aren't they getting the communities?
That is a phenomenal question that definitely applies to the United States.
Right, because it's like, I mean, I am sure that, if you have, like you say, 13% of your population, is people of color, I am sure that there are 40%, 50, 60, 80%, like a ton of people who could easily meet that representation.
For sure.
Why aren't they applying? And if they're applying, why aren't they being successful? And as long as the reason that people are not being successful in the selection process is for bona fide reasons, we're fine. Or are there little things that rule people out before they even get there? Right. And one of the things that came up was in this group that I'm involved in is looking at minimum education levels. And when we say that we're looking for candidates with education levels of in excess of high school, to include some post-secondary, not everybody can afford that. And it's not because they're stupid and it's not because they're unmotivated. It's just because life happens and there's a series of events. And I mean, schooling here, as I'm sure it is in the States, is very expensive and it's just not on everybody's radar. And so then to say to that candidate, like, sorry, bud, like you would be ideal. You are probably like senior command material, but you didn't, take a year off and go to college.
Right. So I would, my counter to that would be, that's more of a problem of, so it's like, yeah, they are qualified, but they can't meet the accommodations because of finances or let's just use resources.
Yeah.
Right. So the problem, so the solution, in my opinion, shouldn't be, let's just get people who don't have the resources onto the field. Let's work on making sure they can get the resources so they can get to where they need to be. It's like you're tackling, not you, the metaphorical you is attacking the wrong issue.
Exactly.
That's a big thing to say with anything. When it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, that's a big problem I have with affirmative action. It's like, well, don't set these people up for failure either. Address the problems that need to be addressed at the root, that these communities are struggling and they need help, right? Once they get that help, it's going to be easy for them to get to your goal.
Well, yeah, because one of the things that we're talking about, and it's just in the talking stages now, is saying to people, okay, you've met all the other requirements, but you don't have the education component. What if that policing agency was able to say, within the next 5 years, we will provide you with the opportunity to get that level of education, and you will have funding because now you've got a good paying job. So we'll give you 5 years to play catch up. Mm-hmm. Right. And then after 5 years, if you don't, then let's revisit that and see what the issue is. But I would think that for most people, in trade jobs, right, where you start and it's like, you have a minimum level.
An apprenticeship. Yeah.
Exactly. Right. And you've got to achieve these goals and you have to go to additional schooling outside of your job. Then I think that would eliminate that barrier.
I agree. I totally agree. I think in general, not just policing, with a lot of things, I think people need to take that trade route. Where let me ask you this: did you learn more on the street or in the academy?
Oh, totally on the street.
Of course, right? That's the same thing. I learned more. Like I'm a live stream producer. I do podcasting. I learned more about podcasting by myself. I didn't learn anything about podcasting in school because about that time no one was teaching it. But even my job now as a live stream producer, I didn't learn any of that in school. Zero in college. No, I got plenty of benefits other than college, but you learn more on the street. So even sometimes if education is that resource, that's the issue, maybe even the answer isn't make education more accessible, which it should be for a lot of things, but also make it a little more unnecessary. Learn on the job. You can teach people on the job. They're going to pick it up a lot quicker and a lot cheaper than paying $8,000 in debt to go to college. Yeah.
And I don't know why the stumbling block is you need to have gone to college or university for a few courses. Because as you said, I mean, not everybody has the opportunity. Not everybody's inclined. Not everybody is academically inclined, but if I was in trouble, I know who I'd want. right? It might be that person that absolutely crashes and burns at exams and writing papers.
Yeah. That's a whole conversation on the educational system. But let's keep it to the police educational system. I want to take it back a little bit to training as well. Now, when you're going through the academy, what is the thing they lean on the most when they're trying to teach you? Is it more of the physical stuff? Is it more of these are the kind of crimes that are going to go? Is it more of just passing a test like any other type of schooling? Where is the focus on the academy? Is it more of here's how to notice a problem in yourself? Like here's how to notice your own mental issues. Is that even addressed at all?
I think now they are looking at mental health issues with frontline responders just because it's out of control. In the States here, the numbers of officers who are committing suicide as a viable option, never mind addiction issues and PTSD.
Divorce rates.
Yeah, PTSD is through the roof. Back in the day, it was just sort of suck it up, buttercup, and then you end up with all these for lack of a better term, broken toys, right? All these people who just can't really function because they are so badly broken. Now, I think what they're training officers is to be aware of their own mental health. They're looking at the tie-ins, and they've been doing this for a while, between physical health, mental health, sort of nutrition, that whole, getting enough sleep, all of that stuff. I know in policing, it's still sort of a badge of courage of, I haven't slept for days. And it's like, well, that's great.
That's
so how's your decision? How's your decision-making process?
Yeah. You shouldn't be on the street. Like you shouldn't be showing up to an armed robbery. Like you should hit the sack.
Yeah. And unfortunately it's like, well, the flip side is that, well, we don't have enough people, so we need people to keep working, and you don't get to pick and choose your calls and all that sort of stuff. So, but just for the officers to sort of say, like, if there's a life past policing, there's a life outside of policing. This is as my one of my training sergeants said, policing is like no other mistress, right? It's just like, because it's 24 hours a day, it's nonstop. It can be always exciting if you want it to be. You can hang around the station all the time, and it's exciting. Right? But say, no, it's not a seductive mistress. Don't do that. Go home, get some real friends outside of policing, get a hobby, get a dog, I don't know, do something, and get some sleep.
And I think it's a part of that, because after doing my podcast with Chris Engelbert on police retirement and pension funds and all the finances behind policing, I think that needs to be trained in the academy as well. Like, listen, here's how much your salary is, right? Let's say you start out 70 grand American, right? Here is how you could allocate that money in these police retirement plans, so you can have that life outside of policing. You can have the money and the budget to work on your mental health. Because, money solves a lot of problems, but budgeting your money you already have will solve even more problems a lot faster.
Well, that's it exactly, right? You get people who all of a sudden are making good coin. Yeah. Policing, like you get, as a fourth class constable. Yeah.
And they're dumb.
Right? Exactly.
And they're men.
Yeah, right. It's like, you're all of a sudden you're making a lot of money, and you've got this like kind of cool job. And so you see officers just spending like all kinds of money on all kinds of stuff. Yeah. And then they're broke and in debt and on and on and on. But I think this is sort of an epidemic everywhere, to sit down with people and say, like, budget your money, right? Because when you budget your money, you're budgeting your life. Right. And if you don't, then you're never going to have enough money. And once you get behind that 8 ball, right, you never get out.
Yeah, it's really hard to get out of debt.
Yeah.
Like it is very, very, very hard to get out of. Someone who has debt, student loan debt, it's very hard to get out of. As much as our government's trying. But all that takes resources. All that takes resources. And whenever someone mentions money, funding or defunding the police, we're saying with taxes, anything that involves money, the first question you have to ask yourself is, how much money do we currently have? And the second question is, where is it going? And the third question is, how can it be reallocated? After that, you ask about more funding or less funding. So let me ask you then, where do you stand on the fund or defund the police, either for American or Canadian police?
I think there's a sweet spot between looking at the
Love that.
funds
Yep.
and, I mean, not just saying about like, okay, as of tomorrow, everybody goes home, we're done with police, but to say, what are the jobs that are specific to police officers that only police officers can do? Let's get them doing those jobs. What jobs can be better done by other agencies who are already getting funding or who could use a little extra funding that's not near as much money as we're putting towards policing to resolve the same issues? Like, for example, mental health issues. Police officers get mental health training, but police officers are not mental health workers. Police officers are not psychiatrists. They're not psychologists. They're not public health nurses. They're not any of those things. And I'm sure it's the same where you are, but here in Canada, our public health is underfunded. Our street level nursing is radically underfunded. And to say, okay, well, instead of having a police officer who chose to be a police officer rather than a public health nurse because they don't really want to be a public health nurse, why don't we take some of that money and put it towards public health? And so the times where police officers get called to those types of calls is where there is more of a police/enforcement apprehension element involved, as opposed to a counseling component and a long-term solution component, which comes from our social services.
I'm with you 100%. At least I was, funding more mental health, 1,000% with you there. Now, when you say the funding should come from the police, why?
Well, I'm saying the money that is allocated towards the police budget.
Okay.
Like, for example, in Toronto now, I believe the police budget is over $1 billion.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot of money. So if they looked at how much of that money is spent in, say, for example, public health type initiatives, responding to public health, all of that, say, okay, let's take a little chunk of that and give it to the agencies that are already doing that kind of work.
So you want to rearrange funds within the overall big police budget?
Take the money, some of the money from the police budgets and take it out and put it into the public health budgets.
Okay, but that is under a different umbrella completely. So it's like taking from box A to box B, you're not rearranging box A. Yeah. So that I understand that argument, but my thing is, we need to fund mental health, right?
Yes,
that is something we can both agree on.
Absolutely.
But why does the money to fund it need to come from the police? Why can't it come from elsewhere? Like, why can't it come from taxation, right? Or why the police? Why not the military? If in the U.S., I would say come from the military. Why the police? Because the police could use that funding for other things to help the police mental health or the police training. Like, why does it need to come from the police? I think that's a big disconnect in this conversation. Is why should it come from the police budget?
Well, I'm saying, just for argument's sake, let's say $10 million is spent annually, and it's like way more than that, but $10 million is spent annually for police officers attending to low-level mental health calls annually. Why don't we then say, we're going to take that $10 million and give it to an organization so they can hire like way more staff, so those calls never get to the police?
Where would they go then?
Where would who go?
Where would the calls go, and who would show up?
Then they would go to the mental health people.
Okay, so
instead of the police, so they never go to the police.
So as you say, mental health police officers aren't mental health workers. Mental health workers aren't cops. Right. So that's the flip. Yeah. So if I'm a mental health worker, my mother was a mental health worker. She worked with very violent people in like a mental hospital. She had to do with people who not overdosing. The opposite of overdosing on heroin, withdrawals on heroin, and like in a hospital. And there were guards in the hospital. There was something she couldn't do without a guard because it was dangerous. So while a cop is used to danger, they're not used to mental health. Mental health is used to mental health. They're not used to danger. Right. So I don't think you should send a mental health worker to a place where someone is super disturbed and they have a gun or a knife, right? But you need to apprehend them, and then you send them to the mental health worker in an opportunity for mental health worker to actually do their job.
Yeah,
right?
Agreed. Yeah,
And if I misrepresented your point, I apologize, but it's a general argument there.
Yeah, no, I mean, I certainly wouldn't say, like mental health workers, off you go,
Right.
because but what I would suggest is that if we can deal with mental health issues more at a grassroots level before they escalate, we may have less calls to service, because you're always going to have mental health calls to service.
Of course.
Say with somebody who is having a psychotic episode, something like that, but there's a lot of times where police are involved in things that really aren't policing issues, or people are just not managing, they're not coping, they're not a danger to themselves, they're not a danger to anybody else. They just need somebody to talk to.
So why should the budget to fix those problems come from the police when it shouldn't have anything to do with them in the first place?
Well, that's it, right? It shouldn't have anything to do with them in the first place.
Right, but the solution, but you want to fund the solution
right
through the police budget.
No.
Okay.
Sorry, because what I'm looking at is the budget's there.
Mm-hmm.
Leave the budget, but somewhere you have to come up with money to fund these other things.
Right.
So where are they going to get this money from? Right. And
you're saying the overall police budget.
If they're taking responsibilities away from the police, then maybe they can take some of the money.
That's a very good point. Okay.
That's what I was trying to say.
Okay, gotcha. See, that was a big disconnect for me. Like, I understand, like, no, after I don't know which example I want to pick in the States, pick one, right? After that happened with the defund the police movement, the idea was this money should come from the police. And I just never understood that. Like, mental health is a problem, but what does that have to do with the police? But your response is it takes the burden off of the police, levy the financial burden as the unit out.
Yeah.
That is the best argument I have heard for why the money should come from the police. So, thank you.
I'll take it.
I appreciate that, because that actually helps. Now, whether I can disagree or agree with you, I understand, right? I don't need to agree with you. I just need to understand. So that was perfect. Because I do agree. It's a big problem. Like, I don't even think traffic cops should be a thing. Right? If I get pulled over, why is it a cop with a gun? Right? I don't understand. I can have a gun in the car, but why is the same municipality that handles traffic cops, not the same cop per se, but they also handle high-speed chases with motor vehicles? It just doesn't make sense.
The thing is, a traffic stop is actually, I would suggest, is one of the most dangerous calls a police officer goes on.
Because it's the most frequent, no?
They have no information. None, right? You get a call for a disturbance. Mm-hmm. The information you have might not be correct, but it's usually, say for a domestic, say a man and a woman, they've been arguing, they've been drinking, yep. You've been called there 15 times before, and they have weapons in the house and children. You got a lot of information to go on there. Traffic stop, you see someone, blow through a stop sign. You got nothing. All you know is that there's somebody in a car, right? Why did they blow through the stop sign? Are they rushing to get to the hospital for some reason? Are they drunk? Are they, running away from something? What do they have in the car? Who do they have in the car? Right. So that is actually a super dangerous call. It's just pulling a car over. That's where the shit gets real. Yeah. Because you have no idea. And even if the car is registered to, some random person.
Will Tarashuk, you don't know that Will Tarashuk is behind the wheel.
And, and you could have no criminal record whatsoever and all that stuff. And then I find out, it's not actually Will behind the wheel, and the car's been stolen. Actually, Will's been thrown in the back of the trunk, and this is really going bad. Really, this is horrible. And I'm here by myself, in the middle of the night, by the side of the road with some crazy guy with Will in the trunk.
Right. That's another phenomenal point.
Right. That's why traffic stops have uniform officers, and the traffic stop can turn into just your little, checking to make sure you've got your insurance papers and all that stuff. And then the car just books it and takes off. Right. And you find out, it's a stolen car. Will's in the trunk. This guy's shot 5 other people, and this is a bad day at the office for the cop.
Yeah. This is going to sound a little weird, but I think we need to have more empathy for police officers. Now, I know that could be a little weird to say because when you turn on the news, you only hear bad things about the police. And don't get me wrong, the police do a lot of bad things that deserve to be called out. And a lot of people need to go to jail. More people need to go to jail. But in order to have change, you have to have empathy for anything. And cops are a very, very tough job. It's a very, very hard job, especially for the reason you just mentioned. Because traffic cops are the most frequent. And as you said, they're the most dangerous because there's no information. So in order for that to happen, you need to have empathy, and I think a big thing that helps is body cameras. Now, I'm sure there's clips of me, even my stupid wrestling podcast from like 7 years ago. This me and Ricky off on a rant talking about how I don't like body cameras on cops, but I think it has its problems. But overall, I think it's been wonders and done more good than harm because it protects everybody involved in the situation, and it keeps everybody on their guard. Now, I do think it makes a cop's job harder because they have Big Brother watching them, and it is hard because it makes a stressful situation a little more stressful, but it's the most fair thing that can happen at any situation, body cam footage. What are your thoughts on that?
I 100% agree. And I mean, when I started policing, like we didn't have cell phones, anything like that, right? So it was like the Wild West. And we didn't even have cameras in the booking halls. And then I remember they brought cameras in the booking halls, and everybody thought like, oh man, that's the end of policing as we know it. And it wasn't. And then people had cell phones and individual cell phones, and with all the security cameras and things. And I remember, like as a parading sergeant, saying to my officers, assume you're being filmed all the time, whether it's just by somebody's home security camera that they're never ever going to watch, or you go to some function and right away everybody's got their cell phones out, right? You pull a car over, people stop and they got their cell phones out. So look good and sound good, right? So I think that the body cam is just the next step up from that. And again, I remember when they started with the body cams, and our association, which is kind of like the union, was saying no, you can't do that. But it's great because it shows everything. I mean, they've got them in the cars. So if you've got somebody in the car who makes allegations, if it's a person who's in custody, it's right there on the camera. Same thing with the body camera. Everything is filmed. It's the audio is on, and really, I think in this day and age, with this generation of officers, they're so used to being filmed all the time, they probably don't even notice. Right?
You know what? They probably don't, because that brings me to my next point. Hey, man, crooked cop gonna crooked, right? They'll still find a way. They don't care, right? And they don't care because they know they can still sometimes get away with it. Like I saw a video not too long ago. This cop pulled someone over. Like they say, smelled something in the car, and on their body cam footage, they were seen placing the drugs in the car. It's just like, well, idiot, you're being recorded.
Exactly.
But even with the body cam footage, they sometimes turn it off. They say, oh, it malfunctions. So crooked cop gonna crooked. So, but I think it reduces it, but they're gonna find a way, man. It happens.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we look at is if an officer said, well, I didn't turn the camera on. I mean, when they first started the program, it's like, okay, well, that's a training issue.
Yep.
Now everybody's been trained, right? So don't be telling me that. The camera malfunctioned. Did it? Great. Let's take it. We'll take it to the tech people and let's get it fixed, right? I mean, crooked's gonna crooked, but and you're always gonna have that bad seed somewhere. But this makes it a lot harder. And I think it makes it a lot better for the officers who have been accused of things, right? They say like, no, here's the footage right here.
Yep.
Boom, we're done.
It works both ways.
And I think it's much better. And just, I mean, never mind for discipline reasons, just for functionality, for doing statements, like you've got your camera on, the person can just start telling you what happened, right? Before, I mean, they still write it down in the memo books, but you have this like tiny little pad that you're holding in your hand and this crappy little pen that doesn't work when it's wet or cold or whatever, trying to get a verbatim statement from a victim or a witness. It's on the body cam. It's great.
Right. Now, this is a technical question, but when they have the body cams, and it's being recorded. Where is it stored? Like the actual, like, because if they have like the camera on them, do they have what's the storage capacity? Where is it stored? Is it actually from the camera fed to the station and it's stored there? Because if you're on the patrol and you have a little camera and they just sometimes it can max out, right? I know how big video files can get. This one's gonna be like 12 gigabytes, right? So how does the actual storage and actual recording of the body cam actually work? Do you know?
I don't actually know that, but I know that it's we have never had a body cam that's maxed out yet. Right. So I think it just goes right directly to a main board and gets stored right away, I think.
Maybe they have something like that in the car. Like I'm just trying to think how, like, as a production guy, I'm trying to think how they would do it. Because like, if it's like even if it's like a terabyte hard drive, that's still pretty big. You can kind of see mine over here in my computer if you're watching. Well, if you can see it on your video, but they're not small. So that's something that came to the top of my mind. But let's keep the crooked gonna crooked. Let's keep the crooked cops. How does a cop become crooked? How does a cop get on the beat and just become a bad cop? Now, there's a little bit of a stereotype in the States that if you were just bad at high school, you didn't get good grades, you do one of two things. You go to the military, you become a cop. And it's just they were the troublemakers in general. So is it more of people entering the force, or is it more of once they join the force, they kind of turn to the dark side? Like Training Day, the movie Training Day. So what makes a good cop go bad, or what makes a bad cop to begin with?
Well, if I knew the answer to that, I'd be making $1 zillion, talking to police agencies.
That's a great answer.
So leave that with me and I'll think about it. And when I'm a zillionaire, but I think that, mostly I think it's kind of turning to the dark side. Most of the selection process, it's not perfect. You're always going to get problems. But again, like we have a year-long probation here. So if there's problems with somebody, we look at it as a training issue. Is it a discipline issue? Is it a you issue? What's the problem? A lot of times that sort of sorts itself out through a variety of different ways. But I think, one of the things that we see here is, we were talking about earlier, individual officers get themselves in a jackpot. They get into some debt situations. They develop some addiction issues.
Gambling. Yeah.
Substance abuse issues, which, I'm off the top of my head, I'm thinking like the oxy issue with painkillers, right? You have an on-duty car accident, you get some painkillers and like life is great. And then your prescription runs out and, the individual's addicted and, are they going to reach out for help or not? Or, are they going to start buying on the street? Then, does it get to be a case of, criminals got something on them and then they have to kind of go to the dark side? It gets to be a vicious sort of thing. And this is where, again, like mental health, putting the supports in place, checking in to make sure officers are okay, looking at that sort of 360-degree wellness check of how are your finances? It's pretty hard to go to work every day when your credit card is just maxed out and it's never ever going to get better, right? And then you go to a break and enter at somebody's home, they're not home, you're looking around and you're thinking like, wow, one of those those rare candlesticks or something is probably worth I don't know how much money. And we've had cases, right, where people, I remember years ago, there was an officer who was rolling drunks, like stealing the money from people who are passed out drunk. And they did a sting operation and they caught him, right? And you're going like, really? Like, dude, really? But, what was his issue? Why did he need to get that, $30 or whatever, $20 that was in that drunk's pocket?
A problem we have here in the States, I just heard about this the other day, gangs, police gangs. Like in California specifically, I don't know if might be Hollywood or like LA. I think it's LA. The LA Police Department has a big problem with police gangs, which is just like, okay, now we're going full circle. You're supposed to stop the gangs, now you're forming gangs.
Yeah.
And it's a massive problem. Not even how you fix that. Well, first off, you fire them, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
All of them
Fine.
immediately. If you're affiliated with a gang, you go to jail. The other gangs in jail and have fun in there.
Yeah.
So it's crazy. It's nuts. But I want to ask you. I want to play a little game here. I want to know a Canadian's perspective on U.S. policing and the U.S. government and how we like. Because you think of the federal government, the FBI, the intelligence agencies, they are a form of police. Even the military. The military is a form of world police, for better or mostly for worse. So I want to know how you, as a Canadian, view the U.S. police force, and I'll flip the tables on you, and see how I think of Canada's police force. And I have a specific example. So please burn my country to the ground. I beg you.
No, you know what? I mean, I think that it's like everything that it's set up with great intentions, and these things seem to be cyclical, where you've got like a really a good group of people who are dominating and the organizations, and things are going really well, and then they kind of lighten up, and then they get some little bit of corruption in there, whether it's moral corruption, ethical corruption, financial corruption. Then it becomes problematic, and then there's a crisis, and then it turns itself around again. And it's unfortunate when sort of multiple levels of law enforcement are in the same cycle, unless they're at their peak, right? So that can be problematic. But I think by and large, I mean, there's easier ways to be a criminal than to be a cop, right? I don't think that's a gateway to criminality. And so I think that, if you look at the number of people who are involved in law enforcement, whether it's as sworn members or as civilian members, the sheer numbers versus the numbers of corrupt officers, that it's still run by people with really good hearts who are doing a really, really good job. But the problem is you get somebody who does something phenomenally stupid, and it taints everybody's view.
And it gets all the attention.
Yeah. Right. As opposed to the officers.
Cop saves a day isn't a good selling story in the news.
No, or cop goes to work every day for 30 years, or crossing guard. Crossing guard does the same crossing, gets no complaints, and the people love her. Nobody's gonna. It's like, well, there's 2 minutes of our news feed that we don't want to fill, right? As opposed to you get an officer or a group of officers, and I think rightly so. Then you got to start looking and say, okay, if these officers were able to become this corrupt, how did that happen? And how do we make sure that there isn't a gateway to that kind of corruption for people who are so inclined? Okay, your turn.
My turn. Well, actually, I'm going to respond to that one first. I think to build off your point, there's also a societal expectation that needs to be adjusted. Right? And what George Floyd was terrible, and that guy deserved to be in prison the rest of his life, as he will be. However, the response to it didn't help. You can have your protests. The protests were, I don't want to say the term mostly peaceful, but they started peaceful. I'll give them that. They started peaceful, and they turned very violent. They turned into riots. Now, how that happens and why that happens, that story for another day. But when you're going out of protest and the cops are there, as they should be there, to make sure nothing happens, and you're in their face, you're screaming, you have signs in their face, you're giving the middle finger, you're cursing at them, you're screaming at them, and they're just saying they're taking it, that doesn't help either. And, saying we need to defund you, throw you all this and that, calling them racist, this, that, and the other, that doesn't help either. So there is some responsibility from everyday citizens, both U.S. and Canadian, because you guys have some problems up there as well. When I get to my turn, on how to fix that issue. Now, you can say the cops started it, but you're not helping anything to finish it. And no one's really interested. No one's interested in finishing it. They'd rather be fighting. Some people want to watch the world burn.
Sorry.
Go ahead, please.
No, I think that also it's as we always say, you're not going to get justice by the side of the road.
Right.
And so I think the role of the protest is really important. So the officers are there to keep the peace, and people are in their face, people are yelling, people are screaming, they're angry. That's fine. That's done. Then the real work begins of how do we mend this? Where do we begin? right? Because otherwise you're just going to have two factions on the street. One group's going to stand there, one group's going to get yelled at, then the other group is going to, have enough of that, and it's tear gas is going to go, and then it's going to just be a riot. It's going to be horrible.
Yep. Businesses burned down. For Christ's sake, they burnt down Seattle. They burnt down a police precinct, and they made it their own city. Within 3 days, people were dead, and the EMTs couldn't get in. So, not much better. The result isn't much better. No. Okay. You guys had the trucker protest. Yes,
we did.
That is like your biggest protest I think Canada's probably ever seen.
Probably, yeah.
Probably. I'm not Canadian. I don't know Canadian history, but let's just for the sake of argument, at least in the past few decades, the biggest thing they ever seen. Now, they were protesting to catch people up. They were protesting the vaccine mandates, not vaccines themselves, the mandates.
Yes.
Now, they what they did is they took their trucks, they went to the capital city, and they pretty much just put a halt to everything.
Yes.
Now, that was a peaceful protest. That was the definition of a peaceful protest. Amazing how there was no violence. Now, another thing that kind of goes to the wayside here in the States, or maybe even up there in Canada, a lot of the truckers were vaccinated. A lot of them were vaccinated. They just didn't like the mandates, the government overreach. So what did Trudeau do? I used to like Trudeau. He froze their bank accounts and the bank accounts of their families on a peaceful protest. That, to me, is more disgusting than anything that happened in the United States protest. That is true authoritarianism. That is almost true fascism. Because we can't even say it's fascism because they were getting a lot of pressure from the Biden administration because their protest caused us economic problems. So Biden, the government, is making phone calls saying, end this now. It's about money. So what's your take as a cop from that protest and the government response?
I think the issue there is we weren't talking just, like your average Joe, the truck driver who took his truck and drove, from British Columbia, like all the way to Ottawa, which is like 10-day drive. It's, and camped out. The issue there, I understand, was that the money was coming from other places, as opposed to like just Joe average, just protesting, doing his thing. And so this went on, and they just they locked down the city. And eventually it's like, okay, we've got to get rid of this because it was gaining far too much momentum, like the impact on the economies. Like you say, it wasn't just Ottawa. It was, the rest of the country, our supply chains, and then, down to the States. It was just causing a lot of trouble.
That was the point. That was the point of the protest.
Yeah.
Right.
But the only way, and again, if it was just, Joe, the truck driver, whose personal views were that this is a bad thing, that's one thing. But I don't know about you, but I wouldn't be able to, keep my truck running 24 hours a day. It's a lot of gas, and keep myself warm because Ottawa is pretty cold in the wintertime, and all that sort of stuff for any great length of time. So the money was coming from somewhere else. So what they're saying is,
so like Americans, for example, were giving to GoFundMe's, right? And the government halted those, right? Yeah. Which, if the company wants to make a decision, that's a different thing. But I'm saying, the actual bank accounts, I bank with TD Bank. The government froze their accounts. That's not related to money coming in, the money they already have. So if they're at the protest and their wife wants to go buy a soda at 7-Eleven, their bank account's frozen. You don't think that's a huge government overreach for a peaceful protest?
It stopped. It's interesting because the perception kind of for the people in Ottawa was not perceived as peaceful at all. It wasn't like riots
honking horns.
Well, if they're doing it for 3 weeks straight,
it's annoying. Right? It's definitely annoying.
And people couldn't leave their houses. They couldn't get out. They couldn't. It was a lot more inconvenient. No, they weren't burning stuff down.
Right.
But, I don't know, when you're setting up hot tubs and things like that, it's a little bit different from,
they had hot tubs.
Yeah. Yeah. And trying to weigh sort of the community safety, community standards. Some of the things that came up were, had this been other communities having protests, how long would it last before the police would have shut them down?
Right.
But
probably. Who are the police to shut down a peaceful protest? Canadian protest rights might be a little different than here in the States, but protesting is supposed to be protected under our First Amendment. I know you guys are a little bit different.
Yeah, as long as it's peaceful, that's fine.
From American perspective, That is the definition of what a protest should be. That is the correct way to protest. Now, we could debate why they were protesting, but that's not the point. The point is, this was a peaceful, by definition, protest. This was the correct way to protest, whether you agree with what they're protesting or not. You don't have to agree with what they're protesting. You got to agree, though, how they're protesting is the correct way to do it. For the most, generally. I'm sure you can find a few examples here and there. And yet the government calling them racist and deplorables, which they weren't. There's truck drivers. There's working people, average people. Sure, so does some weirdos.
Well, it turns out that a lot of them were associated with white supremacist organizations. So again, it wasn't like Joe the construction drivers and his truck. There's a lot of layers of criminality, I believe, beneath the surface.
Okay.
And so that's what changed the dynamic a bit.
So for the sake of argument, I've heard that's not true. But for the sake of argument, that's true. They also have a right to protest.
Yeah.
So you don't have to agree with. If that's true, their ideas are deplorable, completely, but they still have a right to protest. The Nazis marched on Washington as a peaceful protest. Fuck them, but they have a right to do that.
Right.
Trudeau, man, it's really concerning because that's so close to our borders. That kind of they can just freeze your money. That's terrifying. They're not going to protest ever again. So what would have been the right way to protest then? If not that, what would have been the right way to protest?
I think the protest was going fine. It should have been shut down sooner.
Or maybe the government should have just lifted their mandates then. Right? This comes down to the government. From my opinion, you should be more mad at the government than the people protesting. If the government needs to fix it, then the government needs to take action, not just shut it down, just change their policies. If it's that much of an economic problem, then maybe they rethink their policies. They're in power. They're the ones in control.
Perhaps.
All right, Des, I'll let you off the hook. Let's talk. Let's talk with the fair and impartial policing program, because this I think is a big way forward. I appreciate you having that conversation with me, by the way. So the fair and impartial policing program, you were heavily involved in this. So please explain what it is, what the point is, what it does, and what the goal is, and what it wants to do.
Okay, so what happened was, about 8 or 9 years ago, the Toronto Police Service was looking at ways to talk to the entire service about bias, about implicit, explicit bias, one of the things that sort of started this was looking at stats were taken about who gets pulled over. Is there a certain demographic? Is there do more men get pulled over, more people of color? Is there an age group? And why is that? And likewise, we have used to have a practice here where we would, it became known as carding, where someone could be randomly stopped. They didn't have to talk to police, but they could be asked, their name, their address, all that sort of stuff, why they were in the area. And that information would be cataloged. And so it became apparent that, again, a demographic was being stopped more often than not for non-criminal matters, and looking at why that was and in what neighborhoods. And the concern that came out of that was that the neighborhoods that were being targeted were low-income neighborhoods, and the people who were getting stopped more often than not were young Black men. And so we had to then look at why is that happening? Because these are for non-criminal offenses, or just randomly being stopped. And is it just a case of there are more young Black men walking around than young white women, or what's going on? And from that, we then started to look at is there a bias when police officers are looking at criminal activity? So in other words, is there an implicit profiling going on where you think, two people walking down the street, which one is likely to be the criminal? And so the Toronto Police Service purchased a program from the States called the Fair and Impartial Policing Program. And what they looked at was how the assumption is, and I agree with it, is that we all have biases. Some are explicit, which is stuff we can work with, and some is implicit. And so you can say, well, it's an implicit bias. How do I even know I have it? And if I don't know I have it, then how can I manage it?
What's the difference? Explain the difference between explicit and implicit.
Explicit is, you have a bias. I mean, the example I use is, I know I would prefer to eat potato chips over paper clips. If you put a bowl of potato chips in front of me, a bowl of paper clips, I'm going to choose the potato chips every single time. I'm good with that. I own it. I will argue that that's the right thing to do. I believe in it, right? So that's an explicit bias. Implicit bias is where you do things and you don't really know why. And is it from the way you were brought up? Like, for example, there's certain foods I don't like. I've never tried them, but I'll say I don't like them. And that's an implicit bias because there's no reason why. It's just been kind of around me or things I've seen. When we're dealing with people, we look at, who do we think is likely to commit a crime? And how much of it is actually statistic based versus how much of it is our bias. And when we look at statistics, are those statistics backed up by having arrested more people from that demographic committing those crimes than people who are also committing the crimes but don't get arrested? So in this program, it was a one-day program where every member of the Toronto Police Service, whether they were civilian to like right up to the chief, had to take this. And we looked at a variety of biases, whether it was people of color, whether it was a gender thing, whether it was youth. And again, we only had a day, so it wasn't a lot, but it was really interesting conducting the program, facilitating it, because you're trying to get discussion with the officers. And of course, if you sit in a room full of 20, 30 people and you tell them that they have explicit and implicit biases, and they have implicit biases against certain people, which is why they're always arresting those people, it can sometimes be a hard sell.
Right.
But hopefully by the end of the day, if nothing else, we got officers kind of thinking about what they do and why they do it.
I think that's a phenomenal start, especially when it comes to biases. I would assume the biggest bias is racial, that is taught. How about financial bias?
Yeah, right. It comes up. I mean, you work in an impoverished community, and it's like, well, of course these people do this. It's like, well, you do the same thing, right? When we talk about in impoverished communities, in community housing, and you see people sitting out, on the side, like they're standing on the sidewalk, having drinks and whatever, and it's like, this is terrible. Well, what's any different from people in middle class environments on their driveway having their wine?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely nothing.
Or even in the backyard, right? Just having a barbecue.
Yeah, and the difference is that the other people don't have a backyard.
Yeah,
right. So
that's the difference. It's public. Yeah.
You're in an impoverished community and you want to have a beer with your friends. You go to the beer store, you buy a can of beer, and you sit on the park bench, right? Yeah. Because they don't have a living room to go to.
I think a lot of problems that are addressed as racial, yes, they are racial, right? These racial implicit biases clearly exist. But I think the bigger problem is financial. Like why do people commit crime? Most of the time because they're poor.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Rich people create different types of crime, right? Yes. They create more harmful type of crime that they always get away with. So that's a completely different type of crime. Middle class people typically don't commit those kind of crimes unless it's personal. Like murder, mostly murder. I would assume, or assault, right? But like when it comes to general crimes, poor people commit more crime, not because they're a certain color, it's because they're poor.
And then we look at, why are people poor?
Why are people poor? Exactly.
Right? Who is going to be poor?
Not because of that color. It's because they're poor.
Or is it, right? Because there are certain opportunities are not made available because they don't have the look of the CEO. And I teach at a community college, and I took some ideas from this for one of my courses, and I did a whole thing about what does a serial killer look like?
Right.
and
White guy.
A white guy.
It's a white guy. Me. They look like me.
Yeah, right. But it's a white guy, and like Ted Bundy, a very good looking white guy.
Handsome, very handsome,
just like you.
Charismatic.
Right?
Oh, thank you.
Just like you, right? Yeah. So again, right, that whole thing. But when we think of, and again, in criminality, it's like, who is a criminal? Well, anyone who has opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And,
or anybody in need, anybody who needs something.
Yeah. Right. And so you have to sort of be able to go beyond your biases. And we also look at, like, your biases came from your family of origin and your neighborhoods and your communities.
It's also ingrained in your DNA, right? Biases exist from thousands of years of evolution, which is very, very hard to just undo. It takes generations. And yes, the progress of the wheel of progress rolls slowly. And yes. I do think in the past, that progress is speeding up in the past decades. But think of where we were 200 years ago. We've made a bunch of progress where we were 2,000 years ago before that. So
absolutely.
It's very hard to undo what we genetically know. And I know you mentioned on the website, on the program, it's like they do teach you it's not your, like, sometimes it's not always your fault. You don't know what you don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
So how is it actually taught? Like, so who are the people teaching this, and what exactly are their qualified? What makes them qualified to teach on implicit bias?
Well, we purchased the program, and then there were about 20 of us who were trained to be facilitators. Mm-hmm. And so basically we run through the program that was developed, and we did it for a year, and it was like crazy busy and exhausting and fun and not so fun sometimes. But the idea is that we're not going to fix anybody, and we're not going to get fixed, but it's to raise that awareness and to start those conversations, right? Because there's nothing we're going to teach you in a classroom that's going to change your life. It's what you take away, right? So are you going to have a conversation with maybe the person you carpooled with, or are you going to go home and talk to your family about it? Or you're going to go back to the station and say, this was the stupidest course I ever had to go on in my life, and then proceed to talk about it, and then proceed to talk about why you don't have biases. And in so doing, talk about your biases, right? So it's getting, but it gets the conversation going, it gets people thinking, right? And it's a tool. It's not a cure-all, it's just a tool.
How do the officers respond to it? Because I could see some actually taking it in, like people, some being just brushing it off and being like, this is fucking stupid, right? Like generally how do officers respond to it? Because I really do hope they take it with not a grain of salt, they take it open-minded. They go in looking to learn something as an opportunity. Like, you don't have to agree, but you have to understand.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, for the most part, it's really interesting. We found that if we had really interactive classes, which were fun, the evaluations at the end were like, this was okay. Time could have been better spent. The classes that we had where the officers sat with their arms crossed, leaning back, completely shut down, it was like pulling teeth. The evaluations, they said, this was really great. This is something we should have had years ago. It's like, what? And I mean, at the end of the day, like, stupid's always going to be stupid. Haters always going to hate.
Stupid. Yep.
Right. And so there's going to be those people that are just going to think this is a big waste of my time, energy, and everything. But I think for the most part, like, how do you measure success? It's like a generational thing, right? Like, has it changed? Like, the next day, did they go back and they were like, completely fair and impartial in their policing? I doubt it. But if it made a bit of a shift, then it was a success.
Yeah. If you inch a little bit forward here and there,
exactly,
that can make a big difference. Well,
exactly.
I think, Desmond, I think that's phenomenal. I'm glad you're involved in this program, and I hope it continues to evolve. And I think it really could make a difference whether the cops want it to or not. Because, hey, they might say it doesn't make a difference, but in the back of their minds, implicitly they might, subconsciously they might.
Well, that's it. And they built onto it from that. They did that program for 1 year, then built on, and they continue to build every year, and looking at, like different things like poverty, like mental health, like gender, like orientation, gender expression, all kinds of stuff, things that are really important within the communities in Toronto.
Excellent. So you had 30 years of service as a cop. Do you miss it?
I do. I do. Yeah.
Well,
it's funny. I just, I mean, I don't miss getting up at, stupid o'clock to get to work. I don't miss being up, night after night after night. I like sleeping in my little bed on a regular basis, but I miss the camaraderie, and I really miss being a part of something bigger.
Meaning. Yeah. I know exactly what you mean. But hey, you found new meaning in your post-retirement life. You are an author.
Yes.
So you say you work in fiction, but you got the stories. So to me, it's just like you're telling personal stories, but they're fiction. You're telling true stories that are now fake. So please untangle that for me.
Yeah.
I'm assuming it's just, you have these stories, but you can't actually use their names for legal reasons because it was an actual case, right? Am I close?
Well, it kind of like, like you take a story and then you just kind of like, I just kind of spin it a little bit here, a little bit there. So anybody intimately involved with the story might recognize it. But if you weren't, it's a good story. And what's interesting is that in the whole, selling of the series, I had agents and publishers say, like, this doesn't really happen. This doesn't ring true. And it's like, oh, okay. All right. It's like, you have no idea. I mean, it's like to each their own. But yeah.
So could you drop like a based on a true story label on it? Because hey, sometimes that sells extra tickets.
Yes and no, except I don't know, because I wonder if then you're kind of held to a higher standard,
right?
And one of the things I like about writing as crime fiction is my intention is not to re-victimize anybody who is involved the first time around. And I mean, I know we all love true crime, and but
what do you mean by re-victimizing? Like glorifying the crime? Like, can you dig deeper into there for me?
Well, like for family members and people who knew the deceased. I mean, imagine what you're thinking. Okay, I'm going to watch something on Netflix. I'm all set. I'm good to go. You flip something on. This looks great. Then you realize it's a story of somebody you know. Right. And it just kind of changes the whole dynamics. Whereas this way, I hope I've massaged it enough that unless you had intimate knowledge of that particular crime, you wouldn't know that it was that particular crime.
Right. Yeah. We had so I understand. So we had that issue with like the Dahmer series that came out this past fall, and the victims and the families of the victims were not happy.
No.
Which, hey, if I were them, I would also be not happy because the show was phenomenal. Is a terrible word to use, but the way it was created and the art was phenomenal in terms of how it was made and acted and written and portrayed.
Yeah.
But obviously the crimes themselves despicable, and Jeffrey Dahmer is a fucking serial killer.
Well, and I mean, this is the thing.
It's like you're treating with a little more respect, which I respect.
Well, yeah, I mean, and for the families, this never ends. Right. And now, with the internet, it's there all the time. Right. And I can only imagine as a family member, you just hope that no one is going to pick this up and redo it. Right. Because how many years later are we still talking about Ted Bundy and his family members are still out there.
Right. And as well as your victims. So is this no interest in a memoir? Because this is kind of, in my opinion, a creative way to kind of do a memoir of the works of your life and works, pretty much.
Well, it's interesting because it started out as one book that's actually coming out in a couple of weeks, Death Before Coffee. I actually wrote that while I was still an active police officer.
Okay.
And it started out as my thinking I was going to retire, and policing is one of those things where you have a lot of niche information of stuff, and I didn't want to become like that sort of guy who sits in the corner mumbling to himself or telling some poor bastard who's sitting beside him let me tell you about this time and that time. So now I just do it to the whole world. But I wanted to create characters that were more interesting than me, because a little more captivating. in the Mike O'Shea series, which is the police procedural. Mike O'Shea is a little more interesting than me, not much, but a little more interesting than me. And you can take poetic license. And each book, he gets beaten to near death. In actuality, I don't think a human being could take that kind of a beating, sort of year after year and still be functional. But in a crime fiction book, you can.
Of course. Yeah. Well, okay. So let's wrap it up and go home. Tell people where they can find it, where they can buy the books, and when the actual release date of the next one. This podcast is going to be aired on April 12th, I believe.
Oh, great.
So hopefully I can drop it just in time for your book. Yeah, this one airs April 12th. So when does the book actually drop, and where can people buy it?
The first book, 1033 Assist PC, has already dropped, and it's available at Amazon, Barnes and Noble. Bookstores are selling it. And the second one, which is Death Before Coffee, is going to be dropped second or third week of April. So right about the time that you're doing your podcast.
Awesome. I checked it out on Amazon. If you're in the States, it's $17, paperback, $6 on Kindle. So please, go check out the book. I'm very curious. Just speaking to you for this past hour, I think you are a very intelligent man. I think you're very thorough in your thoughts. I think you're very nice. I think you're very kind. So I'm excited to pick up the book and kind of see what your writing style, and hopefully it translates to as good as you are as a podcast. Man, you should, if you have these stories, you don't have the time to tell them, or you have like shorter stories, man, you should have a podcast. You gotta get the mic. You're pretty good at it, man. I know this thing next. I'm not the same next. I run a company that does podcasting, but I think there's a billion true crime podcasts out there. I think you'd be very good on a podcast, even though you've done a bunch of them.
Thank you very much. And let me know what you think of the book.
I will. I'm actually very excited to pick it up. I haven't read a book in a long time, but I'll get it. I'll do it. I'll do it just for you.
It's a quick read.
Before we go, the final question of the Talking with Tarashuk podcast always goes to the guest. So I'm going to open the floor. You can ask me a question, anything you want. If I caught you off guard, you can always plead the fifth. That means you don't have to ask a question. Sorry, plead the fifth in US.
That's okay. I watch a lot of American TV. It's funny. How many people here in Canada think they can plead the fifth?
Yeah.
It's like, no, that's an American thing.
It's an American thing.
You can't do that. What is the best part about doing your podcast? What do you like the most?
I got to tell you, I was thinking about this as we were recording. My favorite part is just understanding different perspectives. Right, let's go back to our Trudeau conversation in the truckers. You have a very different perspective than I do. You have a very different background than I do. Now, I don't agree with you. That's fine. But I understand where you're coming from. And I respect where you're coming from. And those are the kind of conversations I like to have, and conversations I want to have more of. So I'm going to praise you very highly in this podcast. We did it twice. We did it with that, and we did it with the earlier in the conversation with I don't even remember now because
the defunding.
The defunding, right? And the money, where the money comes from, right? And you gave me a new perspective. I can take that perspective when I'm having a conversation in real life, whether it's my girlfriend or my friends and gaming and Discord. I can take that perspective. Again, I don't have to agree with you, but I need to understand where you are coming from. So that's the biggest takeaway I get from podcasting. I understand people's perspectives. Now, it's one thing to listen to a podcast and get that. It's another thing to talk with someone and actually do it and put it out there to the world. Like I tell people in this podcast, if you make me go, ooh, that's interesting, I want to talk to you. And I'm going to have you on the podcast eventually. If you can grab my attention and make me learn something, I'll figure it out. And, and I do it as a courtesy. This is actually, I consider my podcast a service to you, meaning I give you all of the content I create. And you can take it and share it with whoever you want. If you don't find value in it, don't use it. That's on you, man. That's cool. On you. I'm going to give you a bunch of stuff to use. If you use it, amazing. If you don't, I've done all I can do. So the biggest benefit is just talking to people, everyday people. I never would have met you otherwise. One of my good friends actually lives outside of Canada through podcasting. And he's one of my best friends in the entire world. Never met him in person. I've never given him a hug. But
right. That is cool. That's really cool.
It's really cool. It's the connections and the honest discussions. And that's the best part. It's true freedom of expression. It really is.
Yes. Yeah, that's great. Good answer, Will. Good answer.
Thank you. I had it rehearsed. So Desmond, thank you so much for being a guest on this podcast. Thank you for the extra time. We're running up close on 90 minutes here. I could talk to you for hours, but man, I'm hungry. I got to go eat something. So
go eat.
My policy is once a quarter. So in 3 months, I'll bring you back. If you got a new book coming out, we'll have a chat and we'll talk. Next week, I am speaking with a member, an old friend of mine, and a member of my fraternity, because I was in Greek life, believe it or not, Taubes on Phi. And he is now running the alumni club for Hofstra University's TEP chapter. So we're going to talk to him about my days in college, a lot of fun things, the fraternity, and what he wants to do with the alumni club, and the state of Greek life in America. So we talk about policing this week, Greek life next week. But my name is Will Tarashuk. This has been a Talking with Tarashuk podcast. If you want to be a guest on this podcast, email me, will@apspodcast.com. It's apspodcast.com. Desmond is a testament to say that I will answer it if you got a good pitch. But I'll see you next week with a brand new guest. And until then, y'all take care.